Okay, hello. So, what I'd like to do is just do some more stuff on spectatorship, just return to it this week because it's really important that we kind of get our heads around it to prepare us to recap it into the second year. Additionally, when you're making your NEA projects, you need to be kind of thinking about potential alternative readings that people can make for your films as well. And one of the evaluation questions asks you specifically about that. So, obviously, I'd like you to rewatch the Prezi and the video that I did on that. That's from one of the earlier um, material posts. But what I'm going to do now is sort of talk you through the material that we've got here. I'm going to show the videos and things, so you can always mute those and play them properly, because I know that they will likely kind of pixelate and be sluggish and stuff. But what I'm going to do is kind of outline some of these other theories to do with spectatorship, and then get you to watch or rewatch, the case may be, Mulholland Drive. And then I'm going to post a screencast of me talking through my Prezi on Mulholland Drive. Don't go through that until the class that we have on it. But for now, you need to be watching this and then watching Mulholland Drive. Okay. So just to recap, obviously, as you know, spectatorship as a theory and as a kind of process about audience interpretation does feed into exam 1 section B, but also it dominates a lot of the material for exam 2 as well. So it's really important that we kind of cover that and understand it, because with spectatorship as an overall umbrella, there is a lot of different theories within it and a lot of kind of sub theories and so on, and you can kind of take it in any number of directions, but the essential kind of centerpiece of spectatorship is the idea that audiences have the power to create meanings more than directors or the filmmakers. So whatever interpretation you have is valid. Okay, so as we know, spectatorship is kind of an active sort of way of viewing films. Initially, audience theory would generally kind of bundle up the audience into this big mass, and they would kind of identify the audience as kind of and sort of categorize the audience as kind of being quite passive. Spectatorship is about how active we are, and about how we have this kind of dynamic interaction with the film in creating a response. So the process of watching the film is kind of it's reciprocal and it's kind of dialectic. And what that means is that you're kind of having a dialogue with the film, and you're kind of engaging with the film and kind of interpreting it as we go. So if you remember back to Room 237, that is all about that. That is all about like different people watching a film and having different interpretations of it. Obviously, if that's the case, that we all kind of make deliberate decisions ourselves about how we're going to interpret films, then every one of us has a different response based on a number of different areas and a number of different kind of contexts, like our own background, our culture, the other films that we've seen, films that we see referenced, and so on and so on. As we kind of talked about in this general spectatorship Prezi here, there are different, sort of viewing conditions that might affect as well. That whole kind of idea about going to a cinema and, there being 100 people or whatever in the same room and the lights dim, and everyone subjectively experiences this film at the same time, and that is a fundamentally different interaction and engagement with the film as it is to watching it on telly, when you can pause it, when the phone can ring, and if you've got your phone to hand, you might be scrolling, or you might be Netflixing or whatever. So those kind of different ways. And again, if you go back to the stuff that we did at the beginning of the year on Is Cinema Dead, that kind of ties into that as well. So the context in which we're viewing films, those viewing conditions, can kind of change how we respond to a film as well. There's a thing, and it might be worth speaking to Katie about, because I think she knows a little bit more about this than me, is secret cinema, where they have like screenings of specific films, and it's all like hush hush until it's announced, and you'll go to a place like a secret location, and all of a sudden everyone will be dressed up as characters from the film. You might have sort of drinks based on something from the film. So like you might go to a screening of um, Back to the Future, and everyone's like in 1950s stuff, and it's a drive-in, and there's a little bar or a diner or whatever, or Empire Strikes Back, and everyone's dressed like a Star Wars or whatever. So these are kind of different ways that might change how we view a film. And in fact, if you look at something like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, that kind of engaging with the film to that ridiculous degree where you have to dress up as a character from the film, otherwise you're ostracized and ridiculed. That is a kind of key part of that. And some films have really kind of been aware of that, and some of the ways that we watch films and are encouraged to watch certain films kind of change that as well. Like viewing parties and stuff like that. Every film has, as we've already established, preferred, negotiated, oppositional, and aberrant readings of a film, so like different responses, and how our own responses are affected by social and cultural factors. So you might rewatch a film and it might have particular kind of cultural resonance. So, for example, if you watch, the first time we watched Do the Right Thing was as a film on the course, and now if you go back and rewatch it, it's got particular power, after the George Floyd and the kind of outbreak of awareness, rising awareness of police brutality to black people in America in particular, and systematic racism worldwide. And those films have a particular resonance. So this is kind of an overview of areas of spectatorship, and I talk about Hall's readings as well. So Stuart Hall is a theorist, as we've already seen, and he comes up with this. So if you do sociology, you may well have come into contact with Stuart Hall. If you do media studies, you definitely will come into contact with Stuart Hall. If you haven't already done so, you will do for sure. And he talks about these different readings of a film, and about how a media institution has a preferred reading or an oppositional reading. So if you reject the tone of the film or what the film's trying to say. So, for example, when I watch a James Bond film, I really hate James Bond films. I think they're, boys' own little pathetic fantasies of returning to imperialist Britain. That's my specific response to that. I think they're sexist, outmoded, misogynistic pieces of trash. But some people really like James Bond. There's that kind of tension there. And obviously, James Bond films aren't aimed at me. They're aimed at people who enjoy that kind of BS. So that I have an oppositional reading to James Bond. Now, if I was somewhere in the middle, where I kind of didn't really like them but sat through them, then I might have a negotiated reading. And on a personal note, that's probably what I have with Star Wars. I think they're mostly rubbish, but they're fine, whatever. And I'm talking in broad terms here. Obviously, it's a little bit more nuanced than this, but it kind of gives you a kind of a sense of it. And then an aberrant reading is if you watch a film but you just don't understand culturally where it's coming from to make any sense of it. So if I showed you a Bollywood film, most of you would have no awareness about popular Indian cinema. So the form of it would completely confuse you and you wouldn't know what to make of it. All right. So if you watched, in this, the intertextual referencing between the Bergman film and the Bill and Ted film, with Death playing chess and playing Twister and stuff. And if you missed that kind of direct reference because you didn't have enough cultural understanding, that would be an aberrant reading. Okay, so what we're going to be doing is screening Mulholland Drive because it's a really interesting film for many reasons, and it's a great film, I think, because it will provoke hopefully quite a bit of debate and quite a bit of kind of thought and discussion on spectatorship. So when you watch any film, as well as kind of preferably making notes and all that kind of stuff for recall, you should also consider your own response, because spectatorship is often tied in with audience studies. The problem with audience studies is it looks as a kind of an overall audience, like what people thought of a film in general, right? Spectator is about what individuals make of the film. So if you think about whether or not a film is really popular at the box office, or whether or not specific people like it or their response to it. So it's like Room 237 for spectatorship, or Rocky Horror, no, not Rocky Horror, but like Star Wars or something for audience, right? So there's a kind of a fundamental difference there. So when you're watching films, I want you to start thinking about your own feelings in response to them, and how you're affected by how you watched it. So did you watch it on Netflix or at home, on the phone, in the cinema, television? Did you rent it? Was it on 4K? Was it on Blu-ray? Did you get a special edition? Yada yada yada. So those kind of, even like subtle differences about whether or not you streamed it or bought the Blu-ray will change how you watch it, because Blu-ray will have a slightly more reverence to watching it because you just want to be in the moment and watch the film, whereas Netflix, you can pause it, stop, go make a tea, whatever you want to do. So there's a kind of a fundamental difference there, right? If you watch it on television, there may well be adverts in the middle. If you watch it on box of broadcasts, you can only watch it on the computer and not on your television. All of these different things will change how we watch a film, and that's another kind of important variable with spectatorship, because we need to kind of think about how those changes are affecting our response to a film and how that changes over time. So I'm going to be going through some of the theorists as well. So there are a number of different uses and approaches of spectatorship. So I'm going to summarize these, and I put in sort of hyperlinks that you can kind of work your way through a little bit more. So historically speaking, the first kind of theorists that looked at spectatorship were the Frankfurt School. And they were called the Frankfurt School because, surprise, surprise, there were a lot of theorists based in Frankfurt. They were very left-wing, very kind of left of socialism, but they were really critical of capitalism, and they would think about the impact of film on media and on mass audiences. So the core idea of their arguments is that films create an illusion of proximity, right? So in other words, when the screen darkens, when the audience hushes and we all look in the same direction, that whole kind of dream of a life that we see on screen, they kind of create this illusion that we're kind of close to these characters. We're overwhelmed, sensorily speaking, by what happens on the screen, and we kind of feel intimately that we're in that story. All right, so they saw that as an issue because it encourages passive audiences. And again, you can kind of click on this hyperlink, and there's a very slow loading page. My internet is slow, maybe because I've got 1,000 windows open. It's exciting, isn't it? But this page should be an overview of the Frankfurt School and their theories. Now, the Frankfurt School are quite important because they're the kind of the sort of basis on which a lot of audience theory and spectatorship theory sort of grew from as well. That's not loading, so let's just move on. Then we move on to Christian Metz. There are details within this as well that I will go through in a proper class if we ever get back to work and college. But Christian Metz was influenced by Lacan and Freud, and this is where spectatorship gets particularly interesting, particularly if we're thinking about surrealist films as well, because obviously, as we know, Lacan and Freud as psychoanalysts were very, very influential on the surrealist movement. So he talks about a mirror stage of human development, and the mirror stage is the moment in our lives when, as a baby, we recognize our own reflection. It's a really important moment of sort of self-awareness, because that moment where we look in a mirror and see our own reflection as people, as children, obviously as babies, our awareness of the world changes. So we start seeing the world from our own point of view. So we develop an ego and a sense of self. Okay, so this is open. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about this page a little bit here, and then I'm going to pause it, and then we'll go into part 2 where I'll talk about Christian Metz, Laura Mulvey, and so on, because Laura Mulvey is a very, very interesting sort of case study. So yeah, this is a kind of an overview of the Frankfurt School. Loads of stuff here. So if you really want to go deep on this, there's loads of stuff here. But too long didn't read is basically that they were talking about the impact of film on mass audiences. Okay, so I'm going to pause here, then we'll talk about Christian Metz a little bit more, and then Laura Mulvey, and then we'll set up for the screening of Mulholland Drive.